They told us Rome ruled the world. They said every nation bowed to the eagle. Every king trembled when the legions marched. But that's not the full story. Because somewhere beyond the sand in the Nile, under a burning African sun, there was a woman who refused to kneel. A queen who looked the empire in the eye and dared it to bleed. Her name was Amanirenas, and they tried to bury her memory beneath marble and myth. For centuries, classrooms echo the same lie that civilization came from Greece, that power came from Rome, that Africa only watched from the shadows. They never told us that when Caesar's successors stretched their empire south, they met not slaves, not servants, but warriors, Nubians of the Kushite kingdom. These were descendants of kings who had ruled when Rome was still learning to build roads. People whose ancestors carved pyramids while Europe slept in caves, and among them rose a queen, fierce and unshaken, leading her people like fire leads smoke. Imagine that moment. Roman banners snapping in the desert wind. Soldiers armored in steel, faces hardened by conquest. They had marched across continents, crushing nations like dust. Yet here, in the golden heat of Nubia, they stopped because across the river stood Amanirenas, tall, regal, with eyes that carried the weight of generations. To Rome, she was a threat. To her people, she was freedom made flesh. They called her the one-eyed queen, not as insult, but as legend. A scar from battle, proof that she'd fought side by side with her warriors. While Rome's generals sat behind lines, barking orders, she rode into the fray herself, arrows slicing through smoke, her voice cutting louder than any trumpet. Every wound was a story, every scar, a scripture of defiance. But history's gatekeepers couldn't allow that image to live. A black woman who broke the Roman war machine. That didn't fit the script. So they wrote her out. They painted emperors and gods, but erased the queen who made them retreat. That's the betrayal, not just of a woman, but of a whole people's memory. Ask yourself, why did they hide her? Why do we learn about Cleopatra, but not Amanirenas? One fit the fantasy, the other shattered it. One was allowed to be beautiful, the other powerful. Yet Amanirenas was both grace and fury woven together, leading armies, signing treaties, defending her land from the most feared empire on earth. The Romans sent envoys demanding submission. Amanirenas answered with silence, then with steel. When they desecrated statues of her gods, she struck back, tearing down Roman outposts, burning their symbols, capturing their soldiers. She didn't beg for peace, she dictated it. The conquerors became the negotiated. That's how strong her will burned. Strong enough to make Rome talk terms instead of war. So when they told you Rome ruled the world, they lied. Because there was a time when an African queen ruled herself, and that was enough to shake an empire. Did your teacher ever tell you that? The Nile moved like a silver spine through the body of Kush, carrying life, gold, and stories from one generation to the next. Along its banks rose temples carved from red stone, blacksmiths' fires burning like stars, and queens who ruled not from behind curtains, but from thrones built beside the gods. This was Meroe, a city of iron and intellect, the heart of an African kingdom older than Rome's ambitions. Here, womanhood was not confined. It was power itself. The line of the Kandake had already stood for centuries. Women who led armies, negotiated peace, and spoke as the living voice of their ancestors. Amanirenas inherited more than a crown. She inherited the rhythm of a people who had never been conquered. When word came that Egypt had fallen to Rome, Kush understood what that meant. Augustus had crushed Cleopatra's dynasty and now called himself Lord of the Nile. The Romans sent tax collectors and soldiers southward, expecting another easy conquest. To them, Nubia was a margin on a map, a place of gold and slaves. But to Amanirenas, it was sacred ground soaked with the sweat of her ancestors. She saw the empire for what it was, an appetite pretending to be destiny, and she refused to feed it. She gathered her generals beneath the carved lions of Epidemic's temple. The air was thick with the smell of oil and iron, with the sound of drums rolling from village to village. Blacksmiths hammered shields through the night, while children carried water and old men sharpened spears. Every household became part of the defense. When the Romans demanded tribute, Amanirenas sent silence for an answer, and when they pushed deeper into her borders, she met them not with surrender, but with the glint of 1,000 blades rising in the dawn. Across the desert, the legions marched, believing they faced another frightened province. They had no idea the storm waiting for them. From the dunes, Kushite cavalry appeared like shadows, swift, disciplined, fearless. Amanirenas rode among them, her chariot wheels cutting through the sand, her commands echoing over the roar of war drums. The Romans would write later of barbarians, but what they met that day was strategy, unity, and a queen whose courage turned the sun itself into a weapon. She was not fighting for gold or glory. She was fighting for memory, for the right of her people to stand unbent in a world that kept trying to erase them. As the first Roman outpost fell and the empire's messengers rode back in disbelief, Amanirenas watched the smoke rise over the horizon. The empire had finally learned that Africa was not waiting to be discovered. It was ready to be reckoned with. Rome answered with fire. News of Nubian resistance reached Augustus in Egypt like an insult carved in stone. To the emperor, the defeat of his soldiers by an African queen was unthinkable. Orders were sent north to Thebes and beyond. March on Kush, burn their cities, make an example that would echo across the desert. The legions moved as a red tide, armored ranks glinting under the sun, standards lifted high, trumpets crying like birds of war. Behind them came siege engines, engineers, and the promise of vengeance. In Miro, the queen listened to the reports and did not flinch. The first assault took the northern settlements. Smoke rose from the border towns and refugees poured south along the Nile. Amanirenas ordered her scouts to shadow the invaders to know every movement, every weakness. She refused to fight on Roman terms. In her council, she spoke of patience, of letting arrogance march itself into exhaustion. The Kushite warriors melted into the landscape, striking supply lines, vanishing into the dunes. Arrows rained from cliffs. Chariots struck from dry riverbeds and disappeared again into heat and dust. Each victory was small but heavy with meaning, proof that the empire's armor could be pierced. When the Romans reached Napata, they found empty streets and silent walls. The city had been evacuated, its treasures hidden or carried away. The legions plundered what they could, tearing down temples and burning altars to break the spirit of the Kushites. But symbols are not so easily destroyed. As they dragged away the statues of the lion god, word reached Amanirenas. She vowed that for every stone the Romans defiled, she would take a fortress in return. Her messengers spread the command across the river valleys, prepare for the counterstroke. Months passed. The Romans thought they had crushed resistance. Then, like thunder rolling from the south, the Kushite armies reappeared. Amanirenas led them herself. The reins wrapped in her scarred hand, banners whipping in the desert wind. They struck at dawn, swift and relentless, reclaiming towns one by one. In Asan, Roman officers barely escaped. Others were captured and brought before the queen. Instead of rage, she gave them witness. She let them see the strength of a people unbroken. Tell your emperor, she said, that the Nile has its own gods. By the time the fighting slowed, neither side could claim victory. But one truth was clear. Rome could not conquer this land. Negotiations began not out of mercy, but out of necessity. A peace was written recognizing the borders of Kush and freeing it from tribute. In the scrolls of the empire, it was a minor treaty soon forgotten. In the songs of Nubia, it was a triumph sung for centuries. Amanirenas had faced the might of the world's greatest power and forced it to bargain. The queen returned to Miro amid cheers that rolled down the riverbanks. The scars on her face caught the sunlight like iron polish for war. To her people, they were not wounds. They were proof that strength could wear a woman's name. And in the quiet after battle, as the smoke of burnt cities faded and the forges lit again, she walked among her soldiers, reminding them that freedom is not given, it is defended. Ask yourself why we never learn her story. Why do our books praise conquerors but whisper nothing about the woman who made Rome retreat? After Rome and Kush agreed to peace, Amanirenas ruled for several more years. Trade returned to the Nile. Caravans once again carried gold, iron, ivory, and grain north and south. The border fort at Khazar-e-Bram stood as a reminder of the line the Romans could not cross. In letters and reports from Roman governors in Egypt, she is mentioned with cautious respect. They describe an independent kingdom that negotiated as an equal, not as a subject. Within Kush, the queen's victory became a symbol of endurance. Artists carved her likeness on temple walls beside the lion god Epidemic, showing her offering captives to the deity, a record of strength and protection. In Meroe, new temples rose, and the kingdom scribes kept careful chronicles in the Meroitic script that has only partly been deciphered today. Her reign marked the last time a sub-Saharan African power faced Rome and forced it to compromise. Historians now recognize Amanirenas as one of the most capable rulers of her age. She preserved her people's autonomy when most nations around the Mediterranean were absorbed into the empire. Her story reveals the complexity of African civilizations that thrive parallel to Greece and Rome, not beneath them. The silence that followed her in Western accounts was deliberate proof of how easily power rewrites memory. When you tell her story now, center the reality. An African queen who defended her borders through strategy, intelligence, and courage, shaping the balance of power along the Nile for generations. That is the legacy she left, and it still challenges the world's old idea of who built history. After the peace with Rome, Amanirenas focused on rebuilding. Her first priority was securing the frontier, repairing forts, restoring farms, and ensuring that Nubian merchants could travel safely along the Nile. The Kushite economy recovered quickly because it had never depended on Rome. It thrived on its own iron production and trade with Central and Eastern Africa. The Meroitic artisans resumed their work, and the city again filled with the clang of furnaces and the chatter of scribes. The queen's leadership also reshaped diplomacy. Envoys from surrounding regions came to her court, and Roman officials cautiously resumed trade. Gold, ebony, ostrich feathers, and ivory moved north. Fine fabrics and glass returned south. The two powers learned to coexist, a rare balance along the imperial frontier. Within Kush itself, Amanirenas became almost mythic. In temple reliefs, she is shown larger than life, standing before the lion god with captives beneath her feet, a traditional image of protection and justice. These carvings remain among the strongest visual proofs of her reign. They show a ruler, both regal and human, wearing a crown of serpents and holding a curved sword. Modern archaeology has traced her capital's layout: royal palaces, reservoirs, workshops, and the great necropolis where kings and queens were buried under small pyramids. In those ruins, fragments of inscriptions still mention her name. Each fragment speaks to a reality that challenges the idea of a passive Africa. Amanirenas was not an exception. She was part of a long continuum of African governance, education, and architecture that connected Nubia to the rest of the ancient world. Her death date remains uncertain, but the peace she won lasted nearly a century. For generations afterward, Roman forces respected the treaty line. The story of the queen who fought an empire survived in songs, then in silence, waiting to be rediscovered by historians who finally looked south of Egypt for the other half of antiquity. That is where her legacy lives today, in every effort to reclaim the narrative of Africa, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. After Amanirenas' reign, the Kingdom of Kush remained strong for centuries. Her successors continued to rule from Merowe, and the culture she defended evolved into one of the most advanced African civilizations of the ancient world. The Meroitic language became fully independent from Egyptian hieroglyphs, symbolizing a confident national identity. Art, architecture, and religion flourished. Temples blended traditional African symbols with new ideas from across the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. The peace of Amanirenas secured allowed a generation of stability. Trade routes stretched from the African interior to the Mediterranean coast. Ivory, iron, and gold flowed north. Books, glass, and luxury goods came south. Rome's maps marked the southern frontier as Ethiopia Nonska, Ethiopia unsubdued. Even the empire had to acknowledge the line she drew. By the 3rd century CE, the old Kushite capital of Napata faded, but Merowe remained a center of knowledge and craft until changing trade patterns and desertification weakened the region. Eventually, new powers rose along the Nile, Axum to the east, Nubian Christian kingdoms farther north, but the spirit of resistance that Amanirenas embodied became part of their cultural memory. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover evidence of her reign, statues, inscriptions, and the remains of fortresses that once guarded her land. Every discovery rewrites another piece of the ancient world, proving that Africa was never silent in history. It was silenced by others. When you bring her story to screen, you can close on the enduring idea she represents: the defense of sovereignty, the intelligence to negotiate with power, and the vision of a world where black leadership is neither exotic nor rare, but foundational. Amanirenas' victory was not just against Rome. It was against the centuries of forgetting that followed. Her victory became more than a line in forgotten scrolls. It became a mirror for every generation that refused to bow. Centuries after her death, travelers and chroniclers still spoke of a kingdom where a woman once faced an empire and held her ground. Her temples fell to ruin, but her name remained carved in stone beside the lion god she served. Modern historians, artists, and filmmakers now reach back to reclaim her image. Each discovery in Nubia, the fragments of a statue, the outline of a chariot road, the rusted points of arrows, restores another heartbeat of her story. For black people across the world, she stands as proof that African leadership did not begin in chains, but in crowns. The lesson is simple. History is never lost, only buried. Every time someone speaks her name, Amanirenas, it rises again through the dust of centuries. After Amanirenas' time, the Kushite system of female co-rule endured. Later queens, Aman Shako, Amanitor, and others continued to appear in temple reliefs leading armies, granting land, and overseeing major construction. Their cities stood at the crossroads of Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Caravan routes through the eastern desert carried frankincense, myrrh, gold, and exotic animals. Mirway's iron industry became so extensive that the surrounding forests were thinned by smelting fuel, a sign of both prosperity and strain. Relations with Rome slowly normalized. Roman merchants traded along the border posts, and some Nubians even served as auxiliaries in Roman armies. The frontier became less a line of war and more a zone of exchange. Yet Kushite art stayed proudly distinct. Temples showed queens and kings as equals, gods and humans connected by ancestry rather than conquest. That imagery kept the idea of shared power alive long after other empires had faded. Archaeologists working in modern Sudan have uncovered inscriptions that hint at administrative sophistication, tax systems, irrigation records, and letters between governors. They show that Mirway's rulers were literate and cosmopolitan, speaking several languages and maintaining embassies abroad. The kingdom's isolation in modern accounts has always been misleading. It was deeply linked to the ancient world through trade and diplomacy. Eventually, environmental change and shifting commerce weakened Miray. By the 4th century CE, it yielded to new Nubian states farther north. But the memory of its queens endured in oral traditions and regional lore. To this day, the remains of pyramids and temples stand as reminders that African women once governed vast territories with intellect and authority. Amanirenas' defiance of Rome was the brightest expression of that legacy. Proof that when outsiders saw only desert, there were civilizations shaping their own destiny. By the 1st century CE, the Peace of Amanirenas had reshaped the political map of the Nile. The Roman province of Egypt stopped at the Dota Kashkinos, a narrow borderland that the two powers managed jointly. Kush controlled its own affairs south of that line. Roman garrisons kept watch from a distance, and merchants from both sides met at frontier markets to exchange goods. The existence of this neutral zone shows how effectively Amanirenas and her successors forced Rome to respect Nubian sovereignty. Meroe thrived during this era. Excavations reveal elaborate palaces decorated with imported glass, local sandstone, and painted plaster. Workshops produced iron tools that reached as far as Central Africa, while artists carved intricate jewelry of gold and carnelian. The royal necropolis expanded. Each pyramid built for a ruler or queen represented not decline but continuity. Beneath the desert sand, archaeologists have found evidence of writing tablets and administrative seals, clues to a literate bureaucracy that managed trade, taxes, and irrigation in one of the driest regions on Earth. Religion remained a unifying force. The lion god Epidemic, protector of kings and queens, continued to receive offerings carved into temple walls. Reliefs from this period show queens as large as their male counterparts, emphasizing balance rather than submission. The imagery contrasted sharply with that of Rome, where imperial women rarely appeared in public art as rulers. This difference reflected a deeper contrast between societies. The Kushite model of leadership accepted female authority as part of cosmic order. Beyond politics, Meroe was a hub of cultural blending. Greek amphio and Roman coins has been found beside African pottery and Indian beads. Such discoveries prove that the city participated in global trade networks reaching across the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Yet the core of its identity remained African. Meroitic script unique to the region replaced Egyptian hieroglyphs on official monuments, another sign of independence that began under a Amanirenas generation. Environmental stress slowly altered this balance. Over-farming and deforestation around Meroe reduced soil fertility, and the Nile's course may have shifted slightly east, limiting access to water. As natural resources grew scarce, central authority weakened. Still, the traditions of governance that Amanirenas embodied did not vanish. They migrated north into the later Nubian kingdoms of Nubia, Mercuria, and Delodia, which would one day adopt Christianity and again defy outside domination. In modern Sudan, archaeologists continue to uncover this legacy. The ruins of Mayowe, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, hold more than 200 small pyramids and thousands of fragments of inscriptions. Each fragment helps reconstruct how Amanirenas' victory influenced centuries of stability and self-rule. Her story is not isolated heroism. It's the beginning of a political tradition that valued negotiation, strategic defense, and equality in power. The legacy of Amanirenas extended far beyond the battlefield. Generations after her reign, Kushite queens continued to wield authority with the same blend of courage and intelligence she embodied. Their rule was not ceremonial, it was active, strategic, and deeply intertwined with the lives of their people. Temples and palaces across Mayowe and Napata bore witness to a society that combined governance, spirituality, and education. Priests, scribes, and engineers all served the state, and every artifact uncovered from this era speaks to a civilization that valued knowledge, skill, and the power of organization. Kush was no passive neighbor to Rome. It was a thriving kingdom with a sophisticated bureaucracy capable of managing trade, diplomacy, and military strategy. Trade became the lifeblood of Kushite prosperity. Caravans crossed deserts, carrying gold, iron, ivory, and exotic animals, while merchants from India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean brought glass, spices, and fine textiles. Miro's workshops produced iron tools so sought after that they reached communities hundreds of miles inland, fueling agriculture and industry across the region. The economic strength the Amanirenas helped secure allowed the kingdom to maintain a standing army, fortify key settlements, and sustain its independence despite the looming presence of the Roman Empire. Her victory was not just a moment in history, it was a foundation for long-term stability. Art and religion reinforced the social fabric of Kush. The lion-headed god Edemek remains central to royal ideology, symbolizing strength, protection, and divine authority. Reliefs and statues depicted queens and kings as equals, a visible assertion that female rulers were not exceptions, but part of the natural order. These images were more than propaganda. They were declarations of identity reminding both the people of Kush and foreign powers that authority was measured not by gender or origin, but by courage and wisdom. Amanirenas' example set the tone for future rulers who would continue to assert Kushite sovereignty in the centuries that followed. Education and literacy were also pillars of Kushite strength. The Mayowetic script developed centuries before was used for official records, religious texts, and inscriptions across the kingdom. These records still being deciphered indicate a society that valued administration, law, and continuity. Knowledge was preserved and transmitted, ensuring that the lessons of Amanus's reign, resistance, strategy, diplomacy were never forgotten. Scholars in modern times are still piecing together these inscriptions, revealing a kingdom that functioned with remarkable sophistication and foresight. Even as Kush maintained its independence, it was not isolated. The kingdom engaged in diplomacy with neighboring African states, Red Sea polities, and distant empires. Envoys traveled with gifts and messages, while Kushite leaders studied the strategies of foreign powers to anticipate potential threats. Amanirenas herself had set a precedent. A ruler could negotiate with strength, not submission. This approach allowed Kush to survive when other African kingdoms were absorbed or destroyed, demonstrating that diplomacy backed by military readiness was an enduring legacy of her leadership. Environmental challenges would eventually pressure Kushite society. Overfarming, deforestation, and shifts in the Nile's course made agricultural management more difficult, and some cities saw population declines. Yet, even in times of stress, the traditions of Amanirenas established strategic planning, strong governance, and respect for knowledge helped the kingdom adapt and survive for centuries. Later Nubian kingdoms inherited these principles, proving that her influence reached far beyond her lifetime. Archaeology continues to uncover a Amanirenas world. Pyramids, temples, inscriptions, and fortresses tell a story of resilience and intelligence, challenging narratives that have long ignored Africa's independent civilizations. Every dig, every artifact restores another piece of history that Rome and later colonial powers tried to erase. Amanirenas is not merely a figure from the distant past. She is a symbol of African leadership, autonomy, and strategic brilliance. Her story challenges the world's assumptions and reminds us that power, wisdom, and courage have always existed on African soil. The memory of Amanirenas continues to inspire for Black communities today. Her example is proof that leadership, vision, and resistance are deeply rooted in their history. Her victory against Rome is more than a historical anecdote. It is a statement that Africa has always shaped its destiny and that the stories of its queens and kings are essential to understanding the true scope of world history. By reclaiming her story, we reclaim the knowledge that Africa was never silent, never passive, and never conquered in spirit, no matter the power arrayed against it. Long after Amanirenas' campaigns, the memory of her defiance shaped the very identity of Kush. Generations of queens drew inspiration from her example, learning to balance diplomacy with force, ceremony with strategy, and public life with the sacred obligations of rulership. The traditions she strengthened ensured that the kingdom remained independent at a time when neighboring regions were absorbed into empires or destabilized by conquest. Every decree she issued, every battle she commanded, became part of a living blueprint for governance that her successors followed. Kush was no relic. It was a civilization designed to endure. The Nile itself became a witness to her legacy. Caravans and boats that once carried soldiers and tribute now carried merchants and artisans, transporting iron, gold, ivory, and spices. Roads built under her guidance linked cities along the river, creating a network that allowed communication, trade, and military mobilization. Temples in Niroa and Napata expanded, adorned with reliefs of queens alongside lions, camels, and sacred animals. These images were daily reminders to the people that leadership was not defined by external empire, but by knowledge, courage, and unity. education and administration flourished under her influence. The Mayawitic script, though still partially undeciphered, recorded taxes, treaties, and rituals, preserving knowledge across generations. Officials managed grain storage, irrigation schedules, and trade contracts, ensuring that Kushite society could survive droughts, famine, and external pressures. Amanirenas had set a precedent that power required intellect, preparation, and foresight, and her successors carried that lesson into every aspect of governance. Religion remained central to her legacy. The lion-headed epidemic, protector of the kingdom, and the monarchy became a symbol of female and male authority together. Royal inscriptions emphasize the equality of queens and kings in maintaining balance between the people and the divine. Festivals, offerings, and ceremonies reinforce these values, embedding the memory of Amanirenas into both civic and spiritual life. Her story was not a single event. It became the heartbeat of a society that measured power through wisdom, strategy, and communal strength. Kushite military organization continued to reflect her influence. Fortifications along the Nile were strengthened, and cavalry units remained well-trained and disciplined, even as environmental changes altered trade and agriculture. The kingdom's strategic planning ensured that neighboring states and distant powers could not easily impose their will. Amanirenas had shown that a small but disciplined, intelligent, and motivated force could force one of the world's greatest empires to negotiate. Her successors understood this principle and maintained it across decades of relative peace and occasional conflict. Archaeological discoveries over the past century continue to reveal the depth of her impact. Temples, pyramids, and fortresses testify to a society that thrived long after her death. Pottery, coins, and inscriptions show that Kush remained a hub of trade and culture, connecting Africa to the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and beyond. Scholars reconstruct a world where African leadership was sophisticated, autonomous, and respected. Even when outside powers tried to rewrite history, Amanirenas' campaigns are no longer an isolated story. They are part of a larger narrative of African innovation, governance, and resilience. Her influence extended far beyond politics and military strategy. Social systems reflected her priorities. Women held significant authority, and communities were expected to contribute to defense, trade, and religious life. These structures encouraged participation and accountability, ensuring that Kushite society was cohesive and resilient. Amanirenas' reign demonstrated that African kingdoms were not passive observers of global history. They were active participants shaping their destiny, influencing neighbors and standing as equals to empires like Rome. Today, Amanirenas remains a symbol of defiance, strategy, and leadership. For modern African and Black communities worldwide, her story challenges the narratives that have long ignored African agency. She reminds us that history is never just a record of conquest, but a record of those who refuse to be conquered. Her victories, her leadership, and her vision offer a lens through which to view African civilizations not as victims of the past, but as architects of their own futures. By studying the Amanirenas, we see a kingdom that thrived through intelligence, courage, and resilience. We see queens who ruled with authority equal to kings. We see a society that valued education, trade, and religion as tools of strength. And we see a woman who dared to face the most powerful empire of her time and emerged with her kingdom intact. The echoes of her reign continue to ripple through history, demanding that we remember and honor the truth. Africa was never silent. never passive, and never powerless. Even after Amanirenas passed from the world, Kush remained a force that Rome had to respect. The empire had learned that military might alone could not bend this African kingdom. Negotiation, strategy, and the memory of a queen who refused to bow dictated the terms. Envoys traveled along the Nile, carrying messages between Roman governors and Kushite rulers, carefully observing borders, exchanging gifts, and maintaining fragile peace. Trade resumed, but it was never one-sided. Kushite merchants carried gold, ivory, iron, and exotic goods northward, while imported glass, wine, and spices flowed south. Every caravan was a subtle reminder that Kush had survived, that its economy and culture thrived independently, and that the lessons of Amanirenas were alive in every policy and decision. The Roman presence at the border remained cautious. Forts were built along the Dodicos, but the legions understood that open aggression was costly, even in the heart of Egypt. Roman officials wrote with grudging respect about the women of Kush, noting that the legacy of Amanirenas had left a population disciplined, skilled, and proud. The frontier became a zone of diplomacy as much as defense, where treaties were enforced as rigorously as swords, and where Kushite authority dictated the pace of any interaction. Amanirenas' strategy had created a long-lasting equilibrium that Rome had to honor. Inside Kush, governance continued in her mold. Queens held formal authority. Courts managed regional disputes, and scribes maintained detailed records of agriculture, trade, and military readiness. The Meroitic script, still partially undeciphered, shows an advanced bureaucracy that could manage taxation, irrigation, and legal matters. Every system reinforced the idea that African leadership was not only capable but sophisticated, able to withstand pressure from one of the world's greatest empires. Amanirenas' reign had been the proving ground, and the structures she reinforced endured for generations. Culturally, Kush remained vibrant. Temple festivals celebrated gods like Epidemic and Immune, emphasizing both divine authority and civic responsibility. Artistic depictions of queens continued to show them commanding armies, performing rituals, and interacting with deities as equals. These images were not decorative. They were intentional, reinforcing the idea that female and male leadership were part of the same system of power. Amanirenas' image lingered in memory, guiding successors in their decisions, inspiring soldiers and reminding neighboring powers that Kushite sovereignty was absolute. Economically, Kush benefited from its location and resources. Iron production reached its height, feeding tools and weapons across the region. Agricultural systems along the Nile allowed surplus to support growing urban centers in trade networks extended to the Red Sea, Central Africa, and even parts of the Mediterranean. Every successful shipment and thriving marketplace was a continuation of Amanirenas' vision. A kingdom self-sufficient yet connected, respected yet independent. Even as environmental pressures eventually challenged the kingdom, the principles she established, strategic planning, resilient governance, and strong leadership enabled Kush to adapt. Later, Nubian states inherited these lessons, preserving the essence of her rule while adopting new religions, technologies, and trade practices. Amanirenas' influence did not fade with her life. It became embedded in the political and cultural DNA of the region. The Romans, too, never forgot. For decades, their governors in Egypt wrote reports noting the strength, skill, and discipline of Kushite forces, the sophistication of their rulers, and the stubborn independence that Amanirenas had cemented. In maps and correspondence, her name may have faded, but the reality of her victory shaped interactions between the two powers. Kush remained free, prosperous, and culturally rich, an African kingdom that had faced one of the most powerful empires in history and forced it to respect its sovereignty. Her story, largely hidden from Western narratives, offers a lesson that resonates today. African civilizations were not passive backdrops to European empires. They were architects of their own destiny. Amanirenas' defiance, wisdom, and strategy set a standard for leadership that endured far beyond her lifetime. Every palace built, every trade route maintained, and every diplomatic negotiation conducted under her legacy was a reminder that power could be exercised intelligently, courageously, and independently. Even now, as archaeologists uncover fragments of her world, they reveal a society that thrived through foresight, courage, and resilience. Amanirenas' life proves that leadership is not measured by the size of armies alone, but by vision, determination, and the ability to defend sovereignty against impossible odds. Her legacy endures in stone, in script, and in the lessons it offers. Africa was never silent, never passive, and never conquered in spirit. After Amanirenas, the line of Kandake continued to shape Nubia's destiny. Queens like Amanirenas and Amanirenas rose to power, carrying forward the lessons of strategy, diplomacy, and resilience that Amanirenas had proven on the battlefield. These rulers expanded Miro cities, oversaw trade networks stretching across Africa. In the Red Sea, and commissioned temples and monuments that spoke of sovereignty and strength. Every decision reflected the understanding that leadership was a responsibility of both mind and spirit, and that the legacy of therefore was a standard to uphold. Merowe thrived as a hub of commerce and innovation. Iron from the region's furnaces flowed along caravan routes to Central Africa and beyond, while gold, ivory, and exotic animals moved north toward the Mediterranean. Merchants from Arabia and India navigated the Red Sea to reach Kushite markets, bringing spices, glass, and textiles. The kingdom's economy was a testament to careful planning, strong governance. In the independence, Amanirenas had defended trade was not just profit. It was proof that a black-led African civilization could thrive on its own terms, commanding respect from all corners of the known world. Religion remained deeply intertwined with governance. Queens continued to appear in temple reliefs, performing rituals alongside gods, demonstrating that authority and divinity were inseparable in Kushite culture. These images reinforced societal values. Courage, wisdom, and leadership were inseparable from the sacred duty to protect the land and its people. Amanirenas' example endured in the rituals, ceremonies, and public life of her successors, reminding the population that power, when exercised with intelligence and moral clarity, could protect the civilization for generations. Even as environmental pressures gradually challenged Merowe's dominance, the systems Amanirenas had influenced helped the kingdom adapt. Irrigation, fortified cities, and organized military units allowed Kush to survive droughts and shifting trade patterns longer than many neighboring states. Later Nubian kingdoms inherited these principles, proving that her influence extended beyond her life, shaping political structures, social norms, and cultural values for centuries. Roman historians may have minimized her achievements, but the reality on the ground was unmistakable. Kush retained its sovereignty, maintained its wealth, and preserved a culture that was distinctly African, independent, and resilient. Amanirenas' reign became a benchmark, A ruler could face the world's most formidable empire and still secure freedom for her people. Her victory was not a single event. It was a statement about what African civilizations could achieve and a reminder that power is as much about strategy and vision as it is about brute force. The artifacts left behind, pyramids, temples, inscriptions, and fortresses, continue to tell the story of her impact. Each discovery confirms that Amanirenas' legacy was not isolated but foundational, shaping centuries of leadership and societal organization in Nubia. For modern audiences, her life provides a counter-narrative to the Eurocentric histories that erased African achievement, proving that women and men of Africa led, fought, and negotiated with skill equal to any empire of the ancient world through Amanirenas in the queens who followed. We see a continuous thread of sovereignty, intelligence, and resilience. Kushite civilization thrived because it combined strategic governance, economic foresight, religious legitimacy, and military readiness, values Amanirenas embodied. Her story challenges the assumption that African states were passive or peripheral, showing instead that they were innovators, defenders, and shapers of global history long before European powers claimed the narrative. Even now, as archaeologists uncover fragments of temples, inscriptions, and city ruins, the message is clear. Amanirenas was not just a queen who fought Rome. She was a symbol of African leadership and endurance. Her life reminds us that history has been selectively told and that reclaiming it requires seeing Africa as a source of ingenuity, power, and resilience. Through her victories, Kushite queens could govern confidently, trade boldly, and maintain independence in a world dominated by empires, proving that Africa's story was never one of silence, but of strength, strategy, and sovereignty. Even centuries after Amanirenas, her influence reverberated through the Kingdom of Kush. The cities of Miowe and Napata remain centers of learning, commerce, and religious devotion, shaped by the foundations she had strengthened. Artisans continued to craft iron tools and weapons, gold jewelry, and intricately carved statues, while scribes maintained records in the Miowitic script, preserving the knowledge of administration, trade, and ritual. Each piece of work reflected a society built on planning, resilience, and a clear understanding of its own value. A society the Amanirenas had fought to protect and define. Trade continued to flow along the Nile and through the Red Sea, connecting Kush to Egypt, Arabia, and the wider Mediterranean world. Ivory, ebony, ostrich feathers, and exotic animals traveled north while imported glass, wine, and spices reached Merowe's markets. These interactions were not simply economic. They were a demonstration of sovereignty, showing that Kush could engage with the world on its own terms. The merchants, soldiers, and envoys who traveled these routes carried the memory of Amanirenas with them, a reminder that African leadership could command respect without bowing to foreign empires. Religion and culture remained central. Temples dedicated to Epidemiac and Amun stood as both spiritual centers and symbols of governance. Reliefs continued to depict queens and kings as equals performing rituals, leading armies, and interacting with the divine. This visual language reinforced a society that valued strength, wisdom, and balance. Amanirenas' precedent that women could rule, strategize, and lead in both war and peace remained a living truth, influencing decisions, inspiring leaders, and shaping the identity of the kingdom. Even as environmental pressures slowly strained the kingdom, The systems Amanirenas established helped Kush adapt irrigation networks, fortified settlements, and disciplined military units allowed the civilization to withstand challenges that might have destroyed less organized states. Her emphasis on strategic thinking and foresight created a culture of resilience, ensuring that the legacy of her victories lived on even as the desert shifted and trade patterns changed. Later Nubian kingdoms would inherit these principles, showing that her influence extended far beyond her lifetime. Roman observers may have minimized her accomplishments, but Kush's continued independence proved the lasting impact of Amanirenas' reign. The empire may have recorded her name sparingly, but every treaty, trade negotiation, and border interaction carried her legacy forward. Kush remained free, prosperous, and culturally rich, a testament to the vision, courage, and intelligence of the queen, who had first faced the legions and forced Rome to recognize her authority. Artifacts from her era and beyond tell a story of enduring strength. Pyramids, inscriptions, temple reliefs, and fortresses show a society capable of complex governance, thriving trade, and sophisticated cultural expression. Archaeologists uncovering these remnants reveal the depth of Kushite achievement and confirm that Amanirenas' life and victories were not anomalies. They were part of a continuum of African ingenuity, leadership, and resilience. Through Amanirenas and the queens who followed, we see that African civilizations were not passive, peripheral, or easily conquered. They were centers of strategy, culture, trade, and governance led by rulers whose intelligence and courage demanded respect. Her story, preserved in monuments, artifacts, and oral traditions, offers a powerful counter-narrative to histories that erase African agency, showing that African women and men shaped the course of empires and global trade long before modern histories acknowledged them. Even now, as excavations continue, her presence is felt. Every restored relief, deciphered inscription, and reconstructed city tells a story of defiance, intellect, and sovereignty. Amanirenas' victories against Rome were not fleeting. They became the blueprint for centuries of Nubian leadership, a reminder that African kingdoms could withstand empires, protect their people, and define their own destiny. Her life is proof that history is not only recorded by those who conquer, it is also preserved by those who refuse to be conquered. A man's story did not end with her death or even with the gradual decline of Merowe. Her legacy persisted in the way African civilizations viewed power, leadership, and sovereignty. Generations of Nubian rulers carried forward her model, showing that governance was not defined by the sword alone, but by wisdom, strategy, and the courage to defend one's people. The memory of a queen who forced Rome to negotiate became part of the cultural DNA, a symbol of what could be achieved when intellect met bravery and vision across the Nile and through Nubian oral traditions. Her story was told in songs, proverbs, and the murals that survived the centuries. Every time a queen assumed the throne, her example was a guide. Stand firm, understand the enemy, and negotiate only from strength. Amanirenas demonstrated that women could be warriors, diplomats, and rulers with authority equal to kings, a lesson that rippled across generations and into the societies that succeeded Merowe. Her influence helped shape governance structures, societal norms, and cultural values that lasted for centuries. Trade and diplomacy continued to thrive under the shadow of her precedent. Even when environmental changes and shifting trade routes challenged the kingdom, Kushite leaders navigated these obstacles with the foresight Amanus had exemplified. They maintained relationships with neighboring African states, Red Sea polities, and even Roman officials, balancing independence with engagement. Her life showed that survival was not passive. It was active, intentional, and guided by strategy and intellect. Her legacy also reshaped perceptions of African strength. Roman officials may have written cautiously about Kush, but the empire had learned that the legions could not impose dominance by force alone. Amanirenas' campaigns and her negotiation of peace demonstrated the effectiveness of combining military prowess with political savvy. Later historians, archaeologists, and scholars are now beginning to recognize that her leadership exemplifies an African model of sovereignty that prioritized intelligence, planning, and resilience over conquest. For Black communities today, Amanirenas represents more than history. She embodies empowerment, pride, and the reclamation of narrative. Her story reminds us that African women have always led with vision and authority, that kingdoms south of the Sahara were centers of innovation, and that the continent's civilizations have been integral to world history. In every ruin uncovered, every inscription deciphered, and every artifact restored, her example reasserts itself. Africa was never silent, never passive, and never powerless. Her life challenges modern narratives that marginalize African achievement. She shows that true power is multifaceted. It requires courage on the battlefield, intellect, and counsel, and the ability to inspire a people to defend their destiny. A man's victory over Rome was not a fleeting moment of glory. It was the first stone in a foundation of leadership, independence, and resilience that would define Nubian history for centuries. Even as time eroded Merowe's pyramids and deserts shifted over her temples, the story of Amanirenas endures. Scholars piece together fragments, restoring her presence in history while modern storytellers, educators, and communities reclaim her narrative. Her life is a call to remember that African civilizations shaped their own paths, defended their sovereignty, and influenced the wider world in ways that continue to resonate today. Amanirenas is not merely a queen of the past. She is a symbol of what is possible when vision, courage, and intellect combine to protect people and culture. She reminds us that leadership can be wielded with wisdom, that resistance is as much a strategy as an act of war, and that history belongs as much to those who refused to be conquered as to those who sought to conquer. Her story invites reflection. If one woman could make the world's greatest empire negotiate, what does that tell us about the power of African leadership and the narratives we have yet to reclaim? Centuries passed and Merowe fell into decline, but Amanirenas' presence never vanished from the land. Archaeologists working in modern Sudan began to uncover fragments of her world. Pyramids, temples, inscriptions, and fortresses revealing a civilization that thrived long before European empires claimed the stage. Each discovery restores another piece of a history that Rome and later colonial powers tried to erase. From temple reliefs depicting queens with lions at their side to inscriptions that hint at treaties and trade, the artifacts tell a story of intellect, strategy, and sovereignty. Amanirenas' legacy is woven into every stone, proving that African leadership was sophisticated, resilient, and enduring. Modern scholarship has begun to recognize her achievements in a way that Western histories never did. Early accounts dismissed her as a minor barbarian queen, but archaeology and careful study of Roman records reveal a ruler who forced one of the greatest empires of the ancient world to negotiate on her terms. Her campaigns against Rome were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of Kushite intelligence, diplomacy, and military discipline that had sustained her kingdom for generations. Every piece of evidence shows that Amanirenas was not an anomaly, but the embodiment of centuries of African statecraft. The pyramids of Mayowe, though smaller than their Egyptian counterparts, are testaments to the kingdom's sophistication and wealth. Each structure served both as a tomb and a symbol of authority, designed to project power and divine favor. Reliefs carved into walls depict queens and kings performing rituals, overseeing trade, and commanding armies. Images that reinforce the continuity of Amanirenas' model of leadership. Even fragments of Meoetic inscriptions, still being deciphered, hint at administrative systems capable of managing resources, trade, and diplomacy on a level comparable to the Mediterranean empires. Artifacts such as iron tools, gold jewelry, and imported goods reveal the reach of Meowe's influence. The kingdom traded extensively with Central Africa, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean, showing that Kushite leaders understood the power of commerce as well as conflict. Amanirenas had set the precedent. Sovereignty was defended through force when necessary, but also through smart alliances, trade networks, and strategic planning. The economic foundations she helped secure allowed her successors to maintain independence for generations, proving that power was measured as much in resources and organization as in military victories. Her rediscovery is not just academic, it is cultural and symbolic. For Black communities today, Amanirenas represents a lineage of leadership, resilience, and intelligence that predates European influence. She is a reminder that African women have always been central to governance, military strategy, and diplomacy. Every excavation that reveals her world is a step toward reclaiming history, showing that Africa was never silent, never passive, and never powerless. Her story also challenges the narratives imposed by centuries of colonial historiography. When textbooks ignore her, they erase centuries of African ingenuity. When scholars study her carefully, they find a model of leadership that combined courage, intellect, and diplomacy, offering lessons that resonate today. Amani's ability to face Rome, negotiate peace, and protect her people is a beacon of African achievement, a story that proves the continent has always been active in shaping global history. In every pyramid uncovered, every temple relief restored, and every inscription interpreted, Amanirenas' legacy rises again. She is no longer a footnote in Roman records, but a central figure in understanding African civilization. Her life demonstrates that resistance is strategy, that leadership can be visionary, and that a queen's influence can shape an entire region for centuries. The archaeological rediscovery of Kush is not just about objects. It is about reclaiming agency, pride, and the truth of African history. Through Amanirenas, we see a civilization that valued intelligence, courage, and continuity. Her campaigns, her diplomacy, and her governance laid the foundation for a Nubian political and cultural tradition that persisted long after Merowe's decline. Modern excavations continue to uncover her influence, proving that her story is not lost. It was always waiting to be told. The stones of Merowe speak her name, whispering to anyone willing to listen that African women have always led, that African kingdoms have always strategized, and that history belongs not only to conquerors, but also to those who refuse to be conquered. Amanirenas' legacy extended far beyond her lifetime, shaping not only Kushite governance, but the very culture of Nubia and its successor kingdoms. The principles she embodied, strategic foresight, courageous leadership, and the ability to defend sovereignty, became the blueprint for later rulers. Her example was not forgotten when Meroe eventually declined. It survived in the Nubian kingdoms of Nobatia, Mercuria, and Elodia, where queens and kings drew inspiration from her courage and statecraft. In these societies, leadership was measured by the ability to protect one's people, negotiate with power, and maintain cultural identity. In a region where empires rose and fell around them, trade and diplomacy continued to reflect the model of Monteras had established. Kushite and Nubian leaders maintained caravan routes, negotiated with Red Sea ports, and exchanged goods with Mediterranean merchants. Gold, ivory, and iron moved along these routes, while foreign textiles, glass, and spices flowed into Africa. The economy was a demonstration of sovereignty, wealth generated by African ingenuity and industry controlled by African rulers and leveraged to ensure independence. Amanirenas had shown that a kingdom could survive not just through warfare, but by mastering strategy, commerce, and alliances simultaneously. Religion and culture were equally central to her enduring influence. Temples, pyramids, and reliefs built after her reign continue to depict queens as powerful and divine figures carrying forward the symbolism Amanirenas had established. Epidemic and Emin remained central to state ideology, reinforcing the connection between rulers and the spiritual protection of the land. These symbols and rituals strengthened social cohesion and communicated a clear message to allies and rivals alike. Kushite and Nubian authority was absolute, legitimate, and enduring. Even as the environment shifted and trade routes evolved, Kushite and Nubian societies adapted, guided by the frameworks Among Us had put in place. Irrigation systems, fortified settlements, and trained military units allowed communities to survive ecological and political pressures. The Queen's insistence on foresight and preparation ensured that her successors inherited not just territory, but a functional, resilient state capable of surviving change. Her reign became a standard against which all future Nubian leaders measured themselves, ensuring continuity of governance for generations. Amanirenas' influence also reaches into modern consciousness for African and Black communities today. She embodies resilience, leadership, and pride. She challenges narratives that have long erased African women from history, proving that they have been central to governance, military strategy, and diplomacy for millennia. Each archaeological discovery, each inscription deciphered restores her presence and reminds the world that African civilizations were active shapers of global history, not passive observers. Her victories, once buried under Roman and colonial narratives, now serve as inspiration. They show that leadership is multi-dimensional, combining courage, strategy, diplomacy, and cultural stewardship. Amanirenas' campaigns, treaties, and administrative reforms reveal that African kingdoms were capable of sophisticated statecraft, challenging the assumption that empire building was a uniquely European or Mediterranean endeavor. She is a testament to the fact that African women wielded authority with vision, decisiveness, and intelligence long before modern histories acknowledged it. Even as centuries passed and new powers rose in Africa, Amanirenas' story remained a guiding force. Nubian queens continued to draw lessons from her life, balancing diplomacy with strength, commerce with military readiness, and spiritual authority with civic responsibility. These practices ensured that African states remained independent, resilient, and culturally rich, even as larger empires dominated surrounding regions. Her reign was a touchstone, reminding each generation that sovereignty required courage, foresight, and determination. Archaeology and scholarship today continue to uncover the depth of her influence. Pyramids, temple reliefs, and artifacts show that Kush was not just surviving, but thriving under the systems Amanirenas helped establish. Every discovery reinforces her significance. She was not an anomaly, but the embodiment of a long-standing African tradition of leadership, strategy, and resilience. Her life demonstrates that history is not solely the record of conquerors. It belongs also to those who refuse to be conquered and who shape the world in ways that continue to resonate today. Through Amanirenas, we see a civilization that valued intelligence, courage, and strategic vision. Her victories against Rome were only the beginning. Her true legacy was the enduring framework of governance, culture, and economic independence that shaped Nubia and its successors for centuries. She proves that African women were architects of history, that kingdoms south of the Sahara were centers of innovation, and that African civilizations have always been active participants in global affairs. Amani's story is not only a lesson in the past, it is a call to reclaim agency, pride, and the truth of African history in the present. As centuries passed, Merowe eventually faced pressures that Amanirenas herself could never have fully controlled. Environmental changes, deforestation for iron smelting, soil exhaustion, and shifts in the Nile's course began to strain the kingdom's agricultural base. Trade routes shifted as new powers arose along the Red Sea and in Central Africa, challenging Merowe's dominance. Cities that had once thrived under the Queen's guidance faced depopulation, and economic centers slowly migrated to other regions. Yet even in decline, the systems Amanirenas had established endured. Irrigation networks, military organization, and administrative structures continued to support the population and maintain order, ensuring that the kingdom did not collapse overnight. The cultural memory of Amanirenas remained strong even as Merowe's pyramids fell into ruin and temples were abandoned. Her example continued to guide Nubian leadership. Queens and kings of Nubia, Mercuria, and Elodia drew inspiration from her defiance, governance, and strategic vision. Oral traditions preserved her story, passing it down through generations as a reminder of sovereignty, resilience, and African ingenuity. These stories emphasize not just her victories against Rome, but her wisdom, courage, and ability to lead a civilization that could thrive on its own terms. Trade and diplomacy adapted to the changing world. Kushite and Nubian leaders maintained networks with Egypt, the Red Sea, and beyond, leveraging knowledge, alliances, and commerce to sustain their independence. Even in a period of environmental and economic decline, Amanirenas' principles of governance, preparation, foresight, and strategic negotiation remained relevant. Her life had shown that true power is not fleeting. It is measured by the structures, knowledge, and cultural frameworks left behind for future generations. Religion and culture continue to reinforce her legacy. Temples and monuments, even partially ruined, remain centers of identity and continuity. The lion-headed epidemic and other deities continue to symbolize protection, strength, and leadership, reminding rulers and citizens alike that authority was inseparable from responsibility. Amanirenas' precedent That queens could wield power alongside kings remained a guiding principle in these successor kingdoms, embedding her vision into the very fabric of Nubian political and social life. Archaeological discoveries over the past century have confirmed the depth of her influence. Pyramids, inscriptions, statues, and temple reliefs provide evidence of a civilization that thrived long after her campaigns against Rome. Every excavation, every restored monument, and every deciphered inscription reinforces the idea that Amanirenas was not an anomaly, but a ruler in a long continuum of African governance, strategy, and innovation. These findings challenge the narratives that have long minimized African contributions to global history. Her story is more than historical curiosity. It is a template for understanding African leadership and resilience. Even as Merowe declined, the principles Amanirenas exemplified: strategic thinking, diplomatic skill, military readiness, and cultural stewardship continued to shape African societies. Her life demonstrates that African civilizations were dynamic, sophisticated, and capable of adapting to both internal and external pressures. The decline of cities does not erase the lessons of leadership, vision, and sovereignty she left behind. For modern African and Black communities, Amanirenas serves as a symbol of enduring pride and empowerment. She reminds us that African women were rulers, strategists, and visionaries long before colonial or European narratives attempted to erase them. Every rediscovered artifact, every historical insight restores her presence in history and underscores the fact that Africa has always shaped its destiny, defended its people, and influenced the wider world. Her life is proof that leadership, courage, and wisdom are timeless, and that the legacy of African sovereignty continues to inspire today. Even in the ruins of Merowe, Amanirenas' story rises. The stones of pyramids whisper of battles fought, treaties negotiated, and civilizations preserved. Her influence persisted in the governance structures, trade networks, and cultural traditions of Nubian kingdoms long after the empire she helped defend began to fade. History may have buried her, but archaeology, scholarship, and memory have resurrected her. She remains a testament to the enduring power of African leadership, a reminder that civilizations are measured not only by their monuments, but by the vision and courage of the people who build them. Amanirenas' story reaches far beyond the pyramids and ruins of Merowe. It resonates deeply with Black communities today, offering a blueprint for pride, resilience, and cultural reclamation. Her life challenges the narratives that have long minimized African achievements and erased the power of women from history. She reminds us that leadership, strategy, and intellect were not imported concepts. They were forged on African soil, defended with courage, and practiced by those who refused to bow to empires. Every time we reclaim her story, we reclaim a piece of ourselves, a legacy of brilliance, sovereignty, and dignity that colonial histories try to suppress. In education, her example is transformative. When textbooks fail to mention Amanirenas, they deny students a critical model of African excellence. Reintroducing her into classrooms is more than history. It is a lesson in strategy, courage, and vision. Young people learn that African women have been central to governance, that kingdoms in Africa negotiated with empires on equal footing, and that resilience and intelligence were the true markers of power. Her story teaches that Black history is not defined by subjugation, but by leadership, innovation, and the ability to shape the world. Cultural pride finds roots in her legacy. Artists, Writers and historians draw inspiration from Amanirenas to create works that celebrate African strength and sovereignty. Murals, films, literature, and educational programs honor her as a symbol of defiance and intellect. She embodies a lineage of African women who led armies, negotiated treaties, and guided nations. Her victories against Rome are not merely military feats. They are statements of identity, pride, and the refusal to allow others to define African worth. Amanirenas also serves as a counter-narrative to centuries of misinformation and erasure. Many histories paint Africa as passive or peripheral, but her life exposes the truth. African civilizations were sophisticated, strategic, and influential. By studying her campaigns, governance, and cultural impact, we see that Nubia was a thriving state with educated leaders, complex trade systems, and enduring institutions. Her story is a reminder that African contributions to global history have been massive, but often hidden. Reclaiming her narrative is a reclamation of African agency and intellectual heritage. Her symbolism extends into modern social consciousness. Leaders, educators, and activists invoke Amanirenas as a standard of courage, intellect, and uncompromising leadership. Her life illustrates that true power comes from strategy and vision, not merely from force or domination. By embodying these principles, she becomes more than history. She becomes a guide for leadership in the present, proving that African excellence is not a relic of the past, but a living force that can inspire generations. Even in diaspora communities, Amanirenas resonates as a figure of connection to African roots. She represents the strength, intelligence, and sovereignty that African descendants can claim as part of their heritage. Her story challenges narratives that disconnect Black Americans and African descendants from the achievements of their ancestors. By studying her, communities reconnect with the lineage of leadership, trade, culture, and resilience that stretches back thousands of years, reclaiming a pride and identity that has long been suppressed. Archaeology and scholarship continue to illuminate her world, offering tangible evidence of her influence. Each pyramid, temple, and inscription restores her presence in history, proving that she was not an anomaly, but part of a broader tradition of African governance and innovation. Her reign shows that African women shaped history, led nations, and defended civilizations in ways that still reverberate today. Her influence is not abstract. It is concrete, measurable, and inspirational. Ultimately, Amanirenas teaches a timeless lesson. Leadership is defined by courage, wisdom, and strategy, not by who writes the history. Her victories, diplomacy, and governance provide a model for both individual and collective empowerment. She demonstrates that African civilizations were architects of their own destinies, that sovereignty and intellect were central to statecraft, and that the contributions of African women have always been pivotal. By reclaiming her story, modern communities reclaim knowledge, pride, and the truth of African history. Her life remains a call to action. It urges us to uncover hidden histories, challenge eraser, and embrace the power, intellect, and resilience of African civilizations. Amanirenas is more than a queen who fought Rome. She is a symbol of what African leadership has always represented: courage in the face of adversity, vision in the service of people, and sovereignty that refuses to be compromised. Her story proves that Africa has never been silent and that its legacy of power, intellect, and pride is alive today, waiting for those willing to see and honor it. Amanirenas stood on the sands of Merowe as the sun set over the Nile. its gold light spilling across the pyramids her ancestors built. Behind her, the kingdom she had defended still breathed. The hum of the markets, the sound of hammers striking iron, the chants of priests honoring the lion god epidemic. She had faced Rome, and Rome had retreated. She had seen her city scarred by fire, but she rebuilt it stronger. And now, the empire that ruled continents left her borders untouched. She did not need marble statues to tell her story. Her victories were written in survival, in the laughter of children, in the smoke of Merowe's furnaces, in the river that still carried life through Nubia. She proved that African power was not a myth or a whisper from ancient times. It was real, organized, intelligent, and sovereign. Rome sent armies. She sent courage. They had armor. She had spirit. And when the dust settled, it was the African queen who remained. Her defiance carried a message larger than war. Amanirenas showed that the power of a nation lives in the unity of its people. She refused tribute not just for gold, but for dignity. She reminded her people in the world that no empire has the right to define another's worth. She didn't just win a battle, she preserved identity. And for centuries after her name moved through the desert winds, a whisper that said, Africa was never conquered. Even the Romans in their chronicles spoke of her with reluctant respect. They wrote of her eye lost in battle, her relentless strategy, her demands for peace on her own terms. To them, she was an anomaly. To her people, she was a mother and a shield. Into history, the true history. She was proof that the heart of Africa could never be broken. In time, her story faded beneath layers of colonial rewriting. Her statues buried, her name distorted or forgotten, but truth doesn't die. It only sleeps. And now, as the descendants of the diaspora reconnect with their roots, her legacy rises again. She stands not as a myth, but as evidence, living evidence that Africa's greatness was silenced, not lost. Amanirenas reminds us that leadership is not inherited through titles or empires. It's earned through purpose, through sacrifice, through love for one's people. She was not just a queen. She was an idea, an unbroken thread of power stretching from Kush to today's struggle for cultural remembrance. Her victory against Rome is not ancient history. It's a mirror showing us what's possible when pride meets strategy and faith meets action. They will tell you Africa was conquered. They will tell you African queens were ornaments, not rulers. They will tell you civilization began somewhere else, but they won't tell you about Amanirenas, the woman who proved them all wrong. Her name is not just to be remembered, it's to be spoken with pride, because the same fire that burned in her still burns in us. The same strength that faced down an empire still runs through the blood of her descendants. So the next time someone tells you Africa was a footnote, tell them about the queen who defeated Rome. Tell them about Amanirenas, because they didn't discover us. We were the discovery.